Still don't know exactly what causes it, but it can be linked to changes in dopamine.
Alright, you all asked for it, so here it is, the neuroscience of ADHD. And that might sound terrible, but I promise you'll learn something. So Jay has said that people with ADHD wake up with negative 50% dopamine in their brain. Now that's impossible, but let's talk about it. The problem is, that makes it sound like your brain is just a sack of neurotransmitters. Like a water balloon with some amount of dopamine floating around in it. But in fact, your brain is actually more like an apartment complex. Your brain is divided into a bunch of separate areas that are all slightly different from one another and all do different things. And dopamine is only produced in a few of these brain areas. That dopamine can only get sent to other specific brain areas through connections that are sort of like wires. It has been shown in ADHD patients that there's problems with dopamine signaling between cells. This can be due to problems with dopamine receptors, dopamine transporters. This is just one paper. Here's another. There is a lot of literature. But what does this all actually mean? People always talk about dopamine like it's the happy hormone, but dopamine is much more than just a pleasure chemical. Dopamine is released during rewarding experiences, but with a goal, to help you remember how pleasant it was so that you're motivated to pursue that thing again. Our brains were designed for survival, and in order to survive, you can't just avoid death, you also need to learn how to stay alive. Dopamine ensures that when you have a good experience, like finding food in a field, you're motivated to pursue that reward again in the future, perhaps by going back to that same field. So anyways, remember how dopamine gets sent to certain brain areas? Well, one of those areas is called the prefrontal cortex, and among other things, it's important for guiding your attention. To do this, the prefrontal cortex requires the right amount of dopamine and a very closely related neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. Together, the disruption of these two neurotransmitters is thought to prevent your prefrontal cortex from maintaining proper attention. Common medications for ADHD like Ritalin enhance both dopamine and norepinephrine signaling, which is why they're so effective. This is just a very small slice of the pie, and there's plenty of evidence that dopamine and norepinephrine aren't the only problem, so there is certainly more to it than this. If you're still watching, I appreciate you, I hope you learned something, and for the love of science, please drop me a follow.